Welcome back to our panel discussion, Moving to the Cloud with a Secure Cyber Foundation, sponsored by Fortinet, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guests today are Philip Quaid, the Chief Information Security Officer at Fortinet. Paul Morris is Chief Information Security Officer and Executive Director for the Information Assurance and Cybersecurity at the Transportation Security Administration. Colonel Brian Lytle is Program Executive Officer of the Cyber Development Directorate at the Defense Information Systems Agency. Bo Hauser is Chief Information Security Officer at the Small Business Administration. And Greg Hall is Assistant Director of Information Security and the Chief Information Security Officer in the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys at the Justice Department. I'm your host, Tom Temin. And earlier in the prior segment, we talked about something that's really become a big issue. I mean, it's always been an issue in computing where you have to have people log on, but that is ID management, and especially in the cloud, when we no longer have these elaborate directories on premises and so forth. What strategies are you using to make sure that ID management is secure and working, especially given some of the basic plumbing of the internet, which is, insecure by design going back to the 1970s? Greg, you want to tackle that one?
Sure, thanks, Tom. First of all, I'd say, identity and access management is foundational. And it's not only managing identities, it's authentication, and it's access management. It's all of those things together. That's the foundation of identity and access management, is managing those three things and integrating those three things. I think when we talk about identities, it almost kind of comes down to something as simple as, do you trust this identity or do you not trust this identity? And are there varying levels of trust when someone asserts an identity? And today, look at Brian, ecosystem partners for you, right?
Yes.
All the Defense Department entities, all the allies, how do you integrate all of those identities into one ecosystem and share information and resources, right? And to what extent do you trust them? And so I think that's kind of the inherent challenge that we face today. HSPD 12 was one of those things that really was codified to initially address this, right? And to define unique identities across the federal government, to credential those identities, and to be able to assert that credential into an environment and to gain both physical access and logical access to resources. And those credentials have evolved over time, and we've got interoperability now with CAC and PIV and PIV-I and those kinds of things, and it's come a long way. I know within the department we've made significant investments in identity and access management because we believe it's such a foundational capability. And that's both on-prem and in the cloud. And I think that's one of the challenges today, is to understand what that model is going to be. Am I going to host my own identity and access management service and extend that to a cloud environment and to extend that to different on-premise environments and manage it myself? Or am I going to consume a commercial cloud service or commercial cloud service providers' identity and access management service? And I think those are some of the things that we have to work through. But
it gets more complicated because people may be coming into the network or into the application with a mobile device from anywhere in the world.
Absolutely.
Or they might be sitting at their desk on N Street with a standard desktop PC.
That's right. I think in a lot of respects we think about identities in terms of carbon-based slice forms, but there's also identities for devices, right? And I think we would all agree there that, not only are we credentialing people, but we're credentialing, that's right. We're credentialing devices as well, right? So we have to understand what devices are authorized and should be in our environment, which ones are not, and we have to be able to identify that, And so I think that really kind of underscores the importance and what a foundation IDAM is, and how we have to really spend a lot of time, I think, figuring out how we're going to implement that.
Yeah, Paul, thoughts, especially in the TSA environment, which is really a mixture of a lot of security overlay needs.
Absolutely. I mean, across legacy all the way to the innovation. But following on what Greg was talking about, absolutely. Our goal from an architecture perspective is, can we control the flow of traffic from any device? Can we make sure that it's inspected? Is it going into the right channels? And is it, our data centers and how they connect to clouds, forcing that traffic through a trusted internet connection or a secure cloud interconnect, so we know exactly where that traffic is going on. So there's a lot of discussion as to how do you flow that traffic, and then there's an expectation that we have some view and warning if something goes bad there. I'd also add to the talk about those who have access. We spend a lot of time focusing on, the first thing I'll ask is, tell me who the privileged users are, who can put their hands on data where, and how do you know who they are? Can you track them, and how are you going to do that, and what services are you going to leverage? That leads into those other questions. There was a recent breach here several weeks ago that we heard about where an organization's flat network led to the container software, which didn't have username and password credentials to that, and that became the source of the breach or data discovery. There are things in the cloud that we hadn't expected. So we have to look at how people are getting in, just as you said, but it has to be, we have to know who's there. And the mistakes will be by one of our vendor partners or ourselves in how we, set up the configurations and management. How do we oversee that properly? And it gets back to what kind of visibility do we have? So it's so important to what we do.
Bo?
Yeah, and at SBA, as we're endeavoring in our cloud migration, we're implementing the identity as part of the design, and that's something that we weren't able to do with an on-prem model. So traditionally, just when you're talking network access, right, there had to be a network path that existed, and then we layer all these rules, all these firewall rules, which really relate to the device that you're on. And now in the cloud, we're able to also add identity to the network access layer, which is new to us, and it really allows us to get packet level visibility and associate that with an identity, which is new, and that's not available unless you're in the cloud. And so it's really impressive how far that's come. And I think that, combined with strong identity and strong authentication, that's really going to be transformational when it comes to security in the cloud.
Yeah, so you really need security for the authentication, make sure that the identities are trusted, but you also have to protect the data, I would think, Phil. In many ways, it's like if you break into a store full of beer kegs, if you don't have a tap, it doesn't matter.
I think you're right. Today's networks have become borderless, right? So access management and identity management becomes the supreme strategy, right? You need to protect the data wherever it is, in your own data center or in the cloud. So the strategies of micro segmentation, macro segmentation, done with great agility is, in my opinion, probably the first and foremost security strategy we need to embrace. And oh, by the way, do that without overwhelming people with complexity.
Yeah, and then I guess there's another piece to it, is that a given identity may have different access privileges in different contexts.
Absolutely. I think there's another piece to this that we didn't really discuss heretofore, which is the data, right? We can talk about identities, we can talk about authentication, we can talk about access management, we can talk about policies, but there has to be parity in the data with the identities and with the rules for least privilege and with the entitlements that we manage for identities and with roles that people have. And so a lot of times that kind of gets left behind, and we don't think about metadata standards. We don't think about labeling data as it's being ingested, right? And this is what really facilitates fine-grained access, right? So I think when we look at this holistically, IDAM is extremely comprehensive, and it requires a lot of resources, a lot of planning, and takes a lot of time. It's definitely worthwhile, but to get to that panacea of being able to protect our data, at the object level or at the really fine-grained level, these are the things that we have to do. Right, and it's also it's a huge enabler, and there's a huge return on investment if we do it right. And if you just think about things like enterprise single sign-on, right, and the time to actually get to a resource and do your job, right? If we've enabled through a single sign-on capability, several e-litigation applications, and it's seamless for an attorney to get access to that and to go through the discovery information seamlessly. Think about how much of an impact that would have, just in terms of the litigation effort itself and potentially the outcome of the case. So again, I just think it's a foundational service, and I think
we've already seen how it allows us to do just-in-time privilege escalation and just-in-time ports and service enabling and disabling. So you escalate your privilege, you do what you need to do, and then your privilege is back to a normal user. And then if you need a port or a protocol, you get that for a certain amount of time. Those are already built into the cloud and really key when it comes to the granular control that we need.
And Brian, Paul said something earlier that gave me a thought, and that is that in the cloud, when that architecture becomes combined with our on-prem, we're discovering new vulnerabilities that may not have been on-prem but are exclusive to the cloud, which gets to the idea of something that sounds like fun, but really is an integral part of all this, something the DoD does widely, and that is the bug bounty idea.
So we've done a couple of very successful bug bounty operations already. DIS has participated in 2 of them, where we contracted that capability out, had some researchers specifically look for vulnerabilities and come back with results. And it's a really ingenious, rapid, fast way to go find things that we would not otherwise look at with our own particular DoD perspective to go find things. We've had a couple companies just do scanning of all of our external facing portals, et cetera, to look for particular vulnerabilities or ways in that we didn't know were there, had just decayed away, our knowledge had decayed away over time. So some of these ingenious things that are coming out of the commercial industry that are readily available have become very beneficial to us in terms of plugging gaps.
Now, are sometimes the cloud provider, the commercial clouds, part of the infrastructure that's being hit by the bug bounty programs?
Not so far.
I was going to say they might not like it so much.
No, I think we would have to work pretty closely with them to go do that. But they invest tens of millions or billions, depending on which company you're talking about, into their own security. And if they're authorized to operate with us, then they've gone through a fairly rigorous screening process that meet our standards and our confidence levels. Kind of going back to multi-factor authentication, part of the earlier topic, we were talking about fine-grained access. One of the things that we're investing into on the research and development side of the house is a concept called assured identity, which I think is what we're talking about. So we're working with a couple of chipset vendors to actually embed down onto the chipset level for your mobile devices the opportunity to have multi-factors of authentication, not just a thumbprint or a user ID and password combination. It scales beyond that. It's the known route that you take to work. It's the, yes, I'm actually in my office today, I'm plugged into a known port, et cetera. And the more factors that you have within your authentication scheme, the more fine-grained access and the elevated user privileges that you have across all of your systems. So it's in the research and development phase for us right now, but that's something that we're hoping to bring forward in the next couple of years.
Yeah, because that's a tough one, because finding real estate inside a mobile device can be a challenge in itself, even if it's a tiny EEPROM or something that might have the hardware foundation for what you describe.
Yes, but hugely beneficial, not just to us, but I think to not just the federal government, but to all vendors across the United States and the rest of the world. If you can get to that fine-grained level, you know, I only want to be able to see my bank account. I'm not in a trusted location, but yet I want to be able to do transfers between accounts. That's something entirely different.
In the time we have left, I want to ask one final question quickly, and that is, things will happen. Things will go wrong for agencies, as they do for some of the corporations. What are the new strategies for what you might call agile recovery, so that you can get back to some semblance of operating efficiency and maybe not lose too much data? Thoughts on agile recovery? Phil?
Both Greg and Bo were poking at this one earlier. We're getting close to the dream of what I call auto resiliency and auto regeneration. That's where you measure in real time your degree of resiliency. What's the risk of resilience that you're facing? And what could you do automatically to mitigate that risk, such as spin up some new cloud capacity, or maybe implement a new SD-WAN configuration, and maybe, as Bo was saying, automatically push out some new firewall rules. So we're all not there yet as a community, but by leveraging these high degrees of automation and integration, we're going to get there towards what I call auto resiliency.
Okay.
And there's also the notion of a mutable architecture where, you know, if you can imagine an attack taking 20 minutes, right, on average, and then if you can replace that box every 10 minutes, there's no way that that box could be attacked with that specific attack. So a mutable architecture is something I think that's going to, and that's what Paul was saying earlier, is something that is going to really drive up the cost of attacks for our attackers, and you know, part of that resilient architecture approach.
Sure. Paul, final 30 seconds.
You know, I think the opportunity here is that we're growing this visibility, we're growing this hibernation. Visibility is the key, and then the ability to bring together ops and security to work side by side. Something happens, the ability to quickly communicate what's going on, because the idea if there's an attack, it may not be in one place, it may be someplace else. So how do we work together to make sure we don't push out, you know, a self-induced denial of service? But I think that's where the future lies.
All right, great note to end on, the future. I want to thank today's guests. They were Philip Quaid, the Chief Information Security Officer at Fortinet. Paul Morris is Chief Information Security Officer and Executive Director for the Information Assurance and Cybersecurity at the Transportation Security Administration. Colonel Brian Lytle is Program Executive Officer of the Cyber Development Directorate at the Defense Information Systems Agency. Bo Hauser is Chief Information Security Officer at the Small Business Administration, and Greg Hall is Assistant Director of Information Security and the Chief Information Security Officer in the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys at the Justice Department. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin, and you're listening to Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com. Use the search term Fortinet.
On behalf of Fortinet, thank you for joining us. The archive session will be available shortly. If you're qualified for continuing education credit, you will also receive an email with your training certificate. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.